All right, all right. Episode 10 of the Self-Selecting Podcast. I hope everyone is doing well. What are we talking about today? Um, well, getting back on track. Oftentimes I think this starts with letting it go on so long before you actually say, okay, enough is enough. Um, and typically this can be something that they're like, oh, well, it was isolated. It only happened this one time. It's not a big deal. I'm not gonna, I know what I need to do. I've been doing it long enough. Like I can just get back on track. And it's like, yeah, you can. But there is a certain point where you become so inundated in whatever habits are throwing you off track that eventually it becomes less and less isolated and it becomes a tendency. It just becomes a thing you do. It becomes a habit. And then past that, it's like, okay, now it's not even like just a small percentage of the time. Now it's not even like, oh, it just happens every so often. Now it's like, no, it happens all the time until it's like a 1-to-1 ratio of good habits versus not so good habits. And I think two things here. I guess I'll start with the accountability. Okay, so like doing an actual audit of why these behaviors are occurring. So like let's say, or I guess what the behaviors? What are the behaviors? Yeah. So that's where I would start. You've been on a program, you are finding like, hey, the program is effective, but for whatever reason, maybe you lose the motivation, maybe external factors, they just kind of lead you off track. Identifying, okay, what are these things that are leading me off track? Is it the fact that, maybe I'm not taking enough time to prep my meals? So then I'm finding that I grab for what's convenient. So grabbing for what's convenient, okay, well, then are there things around the house that ultimately lead me to make poor decisions with food? Hey, listen, like I can be a little grabber. Like I can be be a fucking raccoon around the house. Recognizing your limits, I'm telling you, because there were times where like truly I could not handle having certain things in the house. And now like living alone, I'm like, I got no supervision, like fucking peanut butter, Nutella, like Pasokin. I cannot have those. Like just I know exactly I'm going to eat them until they're gone. Identifying, okay, what are these behaviors? What is the actual thing that's leading off track? Because there's an unintentional component and then there's an intentional component. Now the intentional component, I would say I would put in that category, and like some of you might not like hearing this, but like intentional, I'm talking like, hey, you're feeling low motivation, discipline is exhausted, and you find yourself like going into the kitchen and you're a little grabby. Okay. Or, the kids, they bring home, I don't know, shit from school, or in part of, I don't know, like they get a kid's meal and some other stuff comes with it and you take bites of that. Okay. That is more intentional than, let's say, because I'm using like a spectrum here. Unintentional would be like, you don't realize that there are calories in a food that, let's say, you're eating, or you're mistracking of some, like in some form or fashion. Like a good example would be like rice, potatoes, any I guess protein too, anything that is going to lose water in the cooking process of some sort. And maybe you're tracking it like wildly off. Or let's say maybe you're using a log on like a calorie tracking app. Like, I mean, I've tracked macros since I was 15, guys. Like I have tracked them so long. And I can tell you, like, even like 2 years ago, last year, there are things that come up and I'm like, didn't know I was inaccurately tracking. Like that was 100% unintentional versus going in and like eating things that I'm like, I shouldn't eat, but I am. That is an intentional, that's not an autonomic act. Like that's something that like on some level, so even subconsciously, like you were doing. It's a fuck up, it's a mistake, but it's not something that truly is like an accident. Whereas like, I think a good example, I think it was like salmon one year, like this was early on, where I was just tracking it and I had it for one meal, like it was like every other day, so a few times a week, and I was in a fat loss phase, and I kept tracking it, but I was using a log that I guess I just saw salmon USDA in the name or whatever it was. I went with it. I was young, and I was like, okay, cool. And then I look and I'm like, it says there's only like 2 grams of fat in this. I'm like, there's no fucking way. Like, and I didn't realize till I was like well past the diet. I think I was in like a new dieting phase, and I went back to that same log and I'm like, oh, yeah, that would make sense. That would explain why I really wasn't in as much of a deficit as I believed I was. Unintentional, intentional. And let's just say, like, consciously, like, oh, hey, like this resulted from me actually ingesting these calories, as opposed to I had no idea until I was made aware that I was ingesting these calories. That's where I kind of differentiate. But regardless, identifying, okay, what is the behavior? Um, what is causing the behavior? That would be our step two. Is this something that, like, what is the actual catalyst? Is it something that you're like, okay, so I started talking about like you don't have the food prepped, so then a lack of preparation ultimately puts you in a position to make poor decisions. Okay, is that correctable? Yes, absolutely. Another one would be maybe, and this is one like this is one I relate to, because like I oftentimes would kind of let the boyfriend or partner, I would let them decide where we're gonna eat, or and then I would just be like, oh, I'll figure it out later. Like I'll just figure it out once we get there. I want to be, um, I I don't want to make the decision. Like I mean that's really just what it came down to. I didn't want to exhaust any kind of mental resources in that regard, and frankly, I just didn't really care either. Like I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I don't want to tell you what I want to eat. It was like, I don't give a fuck. Like I promise, I just care so little about this decision right now. As bad as that sounds. So then I would like get to the restaurant and I'd be like looking at shit and I'd be like, oh man, like, well, I'm not gonna, maybe if I was in like a really strict dieting phase, maybe be like, yeah, I am just gonna get a chicken breast and they're gonna be annoying and be like, yeah, and please don't cook it in anything. Um, And then when I wasn't so strict, I'd be like, I'm going to get something and I'm going to just estimate. I'm going to do my best, but I'm not going to like, I'm going to enjoy this meal and I'm going to know inadvertently that like these are more calories than I probably should eat, but I'm making that conscious decision. Now, this again, it falls in the intentional side of the spectrum here, but it's like, again, the catalyst is every time this happens. So a partner asks me, hey, like, where do you want to go to eat? Or is this okay? Can we go here? I want to go get this. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So a lack of, I would say like assertiveness and foresight into, hey, this is the kind of position that not having an input then thereby puts me in. And ultimately this leads to being off track, which can be a reoccurring event if you're going out multiple times a week, which at one point, the guy I dated before Patrick, like, yeah, that was like, fuck, constantly. We were going out to eat. And like, it really did start to add up then where I was like, I have to really, really try not to get fatter because we're eating out so much. And I'm not planning well enough in advance for these meals. And I'm kind of just going with the flow, which now is creating it now putting me in a position where I'm in a surplus. I'm not even in what I was hoping would be a deficit. I'm now like gaining steadily. So there's two right there. Then there's like decision fatigue. That's another one. People, okay, so this is one I'll tell you, like, since being out on my own, like this year. So I moved out. Patrick and I broke up middle of January. It's been almost 4 months now. February, 3 months. Oops. So sorry. I've found I'm like where I want to put my time in terms of like making decisions around food, that actually has been really freeing. And like it's not something that like prior to Patrick, I kind of got the sense that this is closer in line to like who I am as a person. Like my preferences is I don't like to take a lot of time to make my meals. It feels very inefficient. It drives me fucking crazy to spend like a really long amount of time cooking each meal. then cleaning, and then being like, okay, and I blew through those meals very quickly, and now I have to rinse, repeat, do it again. Like I get very annoyed and get very frustrated doing that. So in turn, like simple, quick meals, that's what I gravitate towards. And it doesn't mean like maybe every now and again, like I'll take the time, but with the way my schedule is set up, with the amount that I have on my metaphorical plate, I'm like, that's not where I want a lot of my time to go. I would want actually to have something as simple as like literally a protein shake, a Fairlife, and then literally have fucking cream of wheat or cream of rice, throw it in the microwave, and then just be like, okay, great, that took under 5 minutes to have and make. And like now any freed up time, if I do want to sit down and like, I don't know, if I do want to really pull out all the stops and prep something, okay, now I have the ability to do it because I didn't waste like fucking 30, 45 minutes every single meal trying to prep this. Like it's not conducive with my schedule right now, and nor has it been. Now, I think for a lot of people, like, yes, they will go into a diet and they'll kind of have this belief that like, okay, in order to be adherent, that means I need to keep my diet interesting. That means I need to keep it spicy. Metaphorically, like I need to have a lot of variety in each meal so that I don't feel like these foods are boring and bland. And there's something to that, yes, but that also can be overpowering and can also become problematic if you're like me and you're like, hey, like I'm working up until a certain point. Then I'm like, okay, going into this meal, here are my options. And if that food is not either already prepped or if I have too many options, ultimately this can be a stressor. This can be a pain point and can make me want to essentially eat off track because I'm like, ah, fuck it. Like I wanted something quick. I wanted something convenient. And the fact that now I'm having to put additional faculties to making this decision. It's just I would rather not have to do that. So keeping decision fatigue related to dietary fatigue or diets in general, being very aware of like where you fall in the spectrum, large bouts of time prepping one single meal just for me. And even if it carries over to two single meals, I'm like, okay, by the third meal, I eat like 4 times a day. I'm like, that is accumulated time that now I'm like, I really wish I had spent that time elsewhere. In the grand scheme of things, let's say I genuinely like, I am like, I don't have a preference. I think this is where keeping a high variety in like meal choices, like having options for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and knowing that like, okay, this is the strategy I'm going to use so that I don't feel like I'm restricted or feel the desire to have cravings. I think that's where people go wrong in that regard, is that they are like strongly trying to avoid having any kind of desire to eat off track. And like for me, frankly, I'm like things like ice cream, like yeah, you have the Ninja Creamy, and that's a little bit different, but like actual like really like decadent, calorically dense ice cream, desserts, cookies, carrot cake, like those are all things I fucking love. And I'm not, again, Ninja Creamy aside, all of the other things, I'm like, I'm not going to fit that into my diet. Like that's going to be something that I'm like, oh, I'm going to go off track to eat this, like to make this a part of my diet. Like that's going to be a cheat. Same thing with like pizza, even like burgers, unless I was making a burger at the house. Like it's still something I'm gonna be like, those are all foods that I've over time just allowed myself to be like, yeah, like I'm going to crave those because they're high calorie foods with high amounts of fat, high amounts of sugar. Like, yes, of course. Pasta, even sushi's a little bit different because you can portion that out, you can make it work, but accepting that like cravings are expected. They're normal in some facets, that like you don't need to have so much variety to your meals that ultimately every meal you're flipping through this Rolodex. If you have the time, amazing. If you have the ability to cook every meal start to finish from scratch, amazing. I don't have that kind of time. A lot of people don't. A lot of people with kids, a lot of people who work full time. You don't have to have kids or work full time to justify that you don't have the time to do that every single meal. And I think that's where there is some like back and forth, like some guilt around like, well, if I'm not adherent and it's because I'm having these cravings, I think people tend to form this like causal relationship between, oh, well, it must be because I'm not creative enough with my meals. I'm not going the extra mile to make my meals interesting. Sometimes the meals are going to be fucking boring and like just accept, like just that's part of it. Like there's nothing wrong with that. Like it doesn't have to be over the top every single time. And I think at least when I shifted my thinking rather than like every meal to keep me on track, because that's where it was coming from. It was coming from a place of like, how can I ensure, like put in all of these safeguards to make sure that I don't go off track. And at a certain point, I'm like prophylactically like building in all these bumpers to make it to where the likelihood of me going off track is so low, but the amount of energy that it's taking, like it's accumulating dietary fatigue. So I think that's something to consider as well. I can argue, like, to be fair, because some of y'all might be like, I really don't agree with that. I can argue the other side, that if you're being really lazy with your meals, and like maybe you should, like, again, it's all dependent on what you need for the diet itself to feel sustainable, and that is highly, highly individualized, up to personal preference. But regardless, I think if you don't have a means to identify, like, okay, where is the culprit? What is causing what is the behavior, and then what's causing it? I don't think I talked about, yeah, no, I didn't talk about this. This is one that I see reoccurring in my life, but also with clients too. The hanging out in the kitchen, the using like, oh, I'm just gonna go do X, Y, and Z. I'm gonna go make tea, and then like you find yourself, you're kind of like wandering into the pantry, or like you're in the middle of making a meal, and like this was something that, like, growing up, this was always a thing. People like taste testing, people taking extra bites of, and it's not like there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But we do have to be honest that that behavior in itself, it does add up. And like that was literally how every meal went growing up. Like I just became very conditioned to, like, as you're making food, you're taste testing it, and like you're taking little bites of individual ingredients. And I didn't realize until I took a very close look at like how often I was doing it. I'm like, whoa, like you're easily scaling up the calories, like in just this like passive grazing sense, by an additional 200 to 300 minimally. If we're talking about high calorie foods, like, I mean, you can overshoot that. And that's before you've even had the meal itself that you're actually making. I find that when I was able, I guess I found, because yes, past tense, when I was able to really identify and be like, okay, when are these events, when are these actually occurring? For me, it was when I was going in the kitchen without some sense of direction, without some kind of plan. Like, hey, like, why are we in the kitchen? And this isn't something you gotta be like, oh, don't go in the kitchen. It's not like, not saying that. So everyone relax. I'm saying if you have a tendency, if you have a pattern of behavior that's essentially reinforcing, like, okay, we can identify every time that you eat off track, you're in the kitchen, and you're in the kitchen just like kind of finding a reason to be there. Well, what happens if you think, in advance, okay, like, what am I going in the kitchen to do? I'm going to grab the meal that's already prepped, that's already like put together. Okay, I'm going to put it in the microwave, and then I'm going to walk the fuck out, and I'm going to just like literally walk like 10 steps. I'm going to walk somewhere else, and I'm not just going to hang out in here. It's not to say it's not to say you can't be in your kitchen. It's to say, like, identifying this pattern of behavior is like, starts with what is enabling this behavior. The other example that probably sounds less disordered than the one I just gave is like, if it is something that you're like, hey, every time I'm in this other, let's say an external environment, every time I go, every time I go to Mexican restaurant, they bring chips and salsa to the table, I will mow through those so fucking fast. Like, not even a question. I won't even be breathing. I'll just eat continuously. And then at that point, I'm like, I already ate like shit. I already ate like 8 full-size tortillas just cut into triangles. Like, it might as well bring me guac at this point. I would have enjoyed it more. I'm just funneling calories into my body. If that's the case, if you're like, hey, it's chips here and it's bread here, well, okay, we're identifying the pattern is it's whenever you were just given something randomly in excess, or you're just given it and you're like, yeah, you can have as much as you want until you get full. That kind of habit, that can be broken. Hey, whenever they bring it, hey, actually, sorry, we're good. Or hopefully we're trying to not be wasteful. Hey, actually, no, don't worry about bringing chips. Don't worry about bringing bread. It's okay. Cool. You go over to, I mean, like, you're at work and there's shit and like, oh yeah, okay, like Patrick would tell me too, like at the hospital would be like, sometimes there would just be like baked goods in the break room, like wherever his like cooler was, his lunch was. So he would make sure to be like, okay, I can eat in here, but I know that like if I'm in here long enough, like I'll eat my meal. But as I'm leaving, I'll be like, oh, I ate my meal, but I'll want to like take a bite of something. I'll want to grab snacks. For him, he would like actually remove himself. He's like, I don't have the self-control, which he has really high self-control. But like in that regard, I would have done the same thing. I would have been like, if I feel, because that happened at school too. Yeah, like there would be like, oh, they brought sidecar like 2 weeks ago, sidecar donuts, bomb, my favorite, like blueberry cake donuts. The likelihood of me simply just acknowledging like, hey, the likelihood of me doing something that I don't want to do, God, this sounds so bad, while I'm in this situation where this behavior is enabled and it's just a matter of like how long I can resist it, well, it's going to go up because my willpower is going to exponentially decrease just from exposure. Why are we enabling a behavior that we know is not good for us? We know we don't want to do it, and we know, hey, we're a little weak when it comes to this particular thing. Can be applied to several things in life, and honestly, when it comes to food, it's not something that you're gonna have an easy time with because people are going to tell you and be like, oh yeah, it's just you can have a bite. Like you're doing so well, you lost weight, it's okay, it's not a big deal. And it's like, yeah, it's not a big deal. And I did lose weight because I'm not doing this fucking shit. I'm not going into the break room and just like eating I'm not having lunch with a box of donuts across from me, like just staring me down. I'm not going into the kitchen knowing that like it's really hard work for me to not get into the snacks, whatever the snacks are for you. It can be for some people, they're like, oh, the rice cakes, like as soon as I open a sleeve, there's 5 in a thing. If I've eaten 2, I'm like, well, it's only a few more. I've heard anecdotes, I've heard occurrences where people are like, very disordered, I know, but this is the reality. This is where I'm sitting, and I don't want that to be, I don't want that behavior to persist. What should I do? Identifying, okay, we talked about what the behavior is. Like you can be like, I'm not losing weight, but if you don't know specifically why, so there's like the problem, there's a symptom in the problem. And I really liked this. I heard this from Layla Hormozy, just binging the fuck out of her videos lately. Great, highly would recommend. And she was giving this presentation. She's talking about symptom versus problem. Okay, and like the symptom in this case, okay, I can't lose weight. Well, the problem is you're not skilled enough to know necessarily why, what is the culprit, what is the cause of not being able to lose weight. You don't have the understanding. You can't identify. You just know the symptom is I'm not losing weight. I can't lose weight. That's now the belief. But the problem itself, if you know, some of you might know, you might be like, yeah, I go out to eat often. And no matter how restrictive I am during the week, whenever I go out to eat, I always seem to overdo it, even when I'm ordering the lightest thing on the menu, even when I'm not drinking, even when I say no to desserts, I still find that my weight continues to hold or even go up sometimes. Some of you might be able to identify it. Some of you might be like, I don't know why. I'm doing everything within my power. And if that's the case, starting point, identify what it is. Second thing, okay, where is this happening? What's the catalyst? What's the environment? And then even like more specifically, okay, is this occurring in the exact same environment every time? Or let's say it is like with what I described, like with partners where they're like, hey, where do you want to go to eat? And I'm like, I don't give a fuck. Like we can go wherever you want. I don't care. Like it would just make me so much happier if you just pick and just tell me what we're eating. Okay. If that is ultimately leading you to not have the right amount of time or control or access, I guess. I don't like how that sounds, but you know what I mean. If that ultimately is leading you to a position where then you're making unfavorable dietary decisions, okay, identifying that is the reoccurring theme. You're really needing to focus on not necessarily all the good things that they're doing throughout the day, not necessarily how to win, but how not to lose. People will inherently, like, they make good decisions when they feel motivated. It doesn't take much for one decision from a caloric standpoint to cancel out those good decisions that ultimately undo everything that you've done. Again, can be applied to many things in life. It doesn't take much to actually net zero, make this something that now you can't reverse. It's like you can make good decisions all fucking day, and then you make one bad decision. Like, I'm gonna tell y'all, Pasokin ruined my life post show. Pasokin is PB2 but on steroids. It's the best powdered peanut butter ever. If you were trying to ruin your diet, if you were trying to actually destroy what it is you're doing and do it incorrectly, what would that look like? Big one for me would be, okay, we're not going to have metrics in place. We are just going to aimlessly diet and hope that over time the body looks better. This is how most people diet, sadly. It wasn't until I started mapping out like people's weight loss targets on like a spreadsheet and actually laying it out for people that I'm like, hey, I know exactly why you're not losing weight. I know exactly why we're technically failing. This diet is a failure. Like, it's like you haven't lost nearly as much weight relative to the amount of time and the effort that you're putting forth. And I know that can sound harsh, be like, wait, like, isn't some weight loss better than none? Well, yeah, technically, but if we're talking about grading, in this case, like the coach, the actual coach's ability to design a program, I do look at it very objectively, very quantitative. Like, if you give me 12 weeks, like, I can tell you 12 pounds, that shouldn't be hard to get off someone. That shouldn't take a lot of work. It should take them doing a minimum amount of work, but it's not unrealistic. Now, if that person comes to me and they're like, hey, I want to lose 24 pounds in 12 weeks, and I'm like, okay, we can do this. What I'm going to say is, like, the minimum amount of work that you're going to have to do in order to lose 24 pounds in 12 weeks, not only is it's not just going to be double what it would be from a literal like energy expenditure, or not energy expenditure, thermodynamic standpoint, but it's going to be so much more. Like, you are not accounting for what's compounding just simply by accruing that amount of dietary fatigue from being in basically 1,000-calorie deficit every single day for 3 months. That in itself is exponential. If you tell me though that, like, hey, six pounds in 12 weeks, can we make that happen? Yeah, effortlessly. Like, it should feel generally effortless, because I mean, like, we're talking about quite literally a 250 calorie deficit a day for 3 months. Not hard. It shouldn't be hard. Maybe it is hard, but it shouldn't be. It's a very reasonable ask. Now, this kind of ties into the next point, which would be, if I didn't want to have a successful diet, well, I would tell you, we're not going to put a deadline on this. This is just going to be aimless. This is going to be whenever you hit your target. If you take someone through a fat loss phase, if you take them through a show prep and you're like, hey, we're just going to put you on stage whenever you hit your target weight without any kind of rhyme or reason. I mean, not only does it put them in a position where there is no method in order to track progress, but that dietary fatigue eventually will get to a point where they can no longer tolerate it. They'll eventually get to a point where they're like, I gotta go off track. What am I gonna do this the rest of my life? You have to have a deadline in place. There has to be a finish line that you cross. And that finish line could be, in fact, a goal weight, but there is a point that we have to be like, no, this is the longest duration that we should be in this fat loss phase. Now, whether someone's in prep or not in prep, what I like to do, what I feel is reasonable, is 25 weeks of dieting. And even for like a show prep, I'm like, that's a long time, dude. Like, that's a long time. If we're talking 25, 30 weeks of like true fat loss, like not diet breaks, not buffers, like seriously in a in a deficit, that is so long. And ultimately, I don't feel confident that after the diet, I don't feel like you're going to be in a great position to not regain that weight back, which in turn is indicative of me putting you in a position that wasn't sustainable. Now you've rebounded. Now you're probably on some level resentful of me, thinking like, well, yeah, the diet worked, but it just kind of sucked me gaining all the weight back and then some. I really don't want that. I've been there myself, and I'm telling you, like, it's a shit feeling to know you're like, okay, I'm just on this ride until I'm not, until I have to get back on. It's not something that, frankly, I think a lot of people are after either. I mean, like, even in the competition space, like, fuck, it'd be great if we could just sustain these crazy physiques. And even though I can't sustain like my leanest, I can sustain a physique with a reasonable amount of work that I feel proud of, that I feel like is adequate, that I feel like is still representative of me encompassing a physique that demonstrates that I have a high degree of discipline. However, if I was like, no, I'm just going to consistently yo-yo back and forth, I'm ultimately only going to be as lean as I can be during these sprints of effort that I can put forth, that always lead me to the same place of then needing so much time off and so much downtime that I end up gaining the weight back. Like, that's kind of defeating the whole purpose. Like, wouldn't it be better if maybe you didn't sprint ahead so hard, you didn't lose so much weight that ultimately now you have to backtrack and you do find yourself, okay, I'm heavier than where I started. Like, no one wants that. Now, I would also say when we're looking at like this list, this how do we ruin a diet? How do we destroy it? Okay. You also have measuring activity, measuring effort, and not measuring that bottom line. And I think that's something it kind of ties back into the actual weight that's lost. If you are someone who has to exert a ton of discipline just to get a little bit of weight off, it's not to say that we shouldn't consider this and that shouldn't be weighed in the decision making of how long you're going to diet, how much weight you're going to lose. But even considering that, even considering the effort that goes into losing the weight, we still have to be honest. The weight like the bottom line is if there's not actual weight being lost, again, like if we're talking about recomping, it's a different scenario entirely. But if the goal is fat loss and weight is not being lost, but you're like, but I'm trying so hard, maybe that's good enough for the individual. And if it is, not my place to shit on that or discredit it, invalidate it. But I do think that as a coach, if someone pays me to lose weight and they come to me and I'm like, but you put so much effort forth, like you did a really good job from the effort side, you tried really hard. It's like, yeah, but did they like get the thing that they paid you for? Did you actually help them lose body fat? Because that's why they came to you. They came to you so that they would be leaner. They're not necessarily leaner, but they did try really hard. The participation trophy like aspect to this, I mean, like I do feel like it's my responsibility being in that position where if you're paying me for something and you're coming to me for my expertise, the bottom line should matter quite a bit. And it doesn't mean it shouldn't be, I guess, like segmented, and the qualitative data shouldn't be also considered. Like, well, did this person make behavioral changes? Did they improve their quality of life? Even if the end goal was not technically hit, we can still weigh that out, but not at the expense of like, okay, but this person didn't lose any weight, or the weight they did lose was negligible. To me, that's a reflection of very poor program design. It reminds me of the movie How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. That was always one that like I saw it like way too young, but now I realize I'm like, oh, that was a list of things not to do. Cool. Okay, this is your list. This is your list of things not to do on a diet. If you don't want your diet to work, here are the things to do. Pandering to the client for problems that do have solutions and convincing them, no, these are not solvable. There are no solutions to these problems. This actually is the best outlook that we have at the moment. So for instance, a client saying, well, I ate off track and I'm not exactly sure why I didn't lose weight, but here's my diary. And when I take a look, I'm like, oh yeah, like not only did you eat off track, like the one meal that we agreed on, but like you had like 7 other occurrences throughout the week that also equated to inconsistent tracking. Like you ate so far off track that I would say like 30% of your week, of your meals within a week were all technically mistracked. They were underreported when they really should have been underreported. Like, it's essential to be able to empathize when a client actually can't do any better in their efforts. And something I do pride myself on, I really do try to take an approach. If this is this person's absolute best, what kind of approach is appropriate? And I don't think that coming down on someone who's doing their very best and like generally is like, um, I'm happy with this progress. I know it wasn't perfect, but I can't do any more based on the circumstances I'm in. In that case, like, no, you're not going to benefit by pointing out and, let's say, criticizing or even offering constructive criticism. But I would say for the client who is making errors, either in food reporting, in their execution, in whatever facet that might be, I think it is your responsibility as a coach to be honest with them and to tell them too, be like, oh, hey, have you ever considered this? Like, hey, these meals that you're eating out, why don't we try it where you only just have that one untracked meal? And then the rest of them, I'd like you to eat in, just so that we eliminate any confusion around whether or not the food reporting is accurate whenever you're going out to eat. There are nice ways to say this. Don't be a dick. Don't like, you don't have to be mean about these things, but you also need to take it upon yourself if you're a coach, or if you're an athlete, like take it upon yourself to, have that manager to employee like conversation around aspects of your program that just don't seem to be jiving well. Telling yourself that it's your best when it's not. I mean, it's a cop out. And I'm not saying that you should be self-punitive. I'm not saying that you should have unrealistic expectations of what you can actually do from an effort standpoint, or what resources you have available, even including skill and an understanding of this stuff. It makes the most sense to identify, okay, here are the aspects that I can change, here are the aspects that have solutions, and here are the ones that don't. Another big one, the accountability. Like having accountability with yourself surrounding, like actually going in and tracking. This is one, guys, like I find myself, I'll go through periods where I'm like, yep, everything is logged. And I can look back and be like, yep, last few days for several months, logged everything under the sun, including like even like water intake sometimes. And then there are the other times where I'm not as strict. And within those times, sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'll log like a couple of my meals, but generally I know, okay, if I log 2 or 3 of my meals, that's what it leaves me with at the end of the day. And I can generally work within those constraints, even if I don't know the exact macros that I'm hitting at the end of the day. I know it's close, but there comes a point where you get a little too lax and you're not as close to those target macros that you were hoping for. And that's where, for anyone who is in confusion around like, well, I don't know why. I don't know why I can't lose weight. I'm not seeing the results that I want. Open your fucking app. Put it in your app. Like this is the simplest way to gain clarity. And I'm telling you, like if you want to understand why something is not occurring, if you want to understand why you feel this state of anxiety, why you're not receiving or seeing the outcome that you'd like to see, gain fucking clarity. Like I cannot tell you how aggravating it is to be in this limbo of, oh, well, I don't know why this is occurring, but we're just going to continue pushing forward. We're just going to hope that something changes without really understanding, okay, like what's the culprit, particularly in this case, like the tracking itself, that will give you the answer. It is so straightforward. It is A to B. Like you will know exactly how much you're eating if you're tracking, and if you're tracking honestly, if the food reporting is accurate, you'll see I'm well over my calories. I'm well over it. That's why I'm not losing weight. It's actually amazing I'm not gaining weight at this intake. That's the kind of clarity that you need to aim for, that you need to strive for, because frankly, whenever, like I can't tell you how many people, like it's such a high percentage, like I'm talking like above 70% of people that come to me, they're like, I don't think it's possible for me to do X, Y, and Z as it's related to like a shift in body composition. I don't think it's possible for me to lose 10 pounds or whatever it is. I've never been able to lose these last 5 pounds. I've never been able to build for X amount of time and really get this shape. And almost every time, almost every single person, I've taken a look at their program and been like, oh, this is a pretty easy to identify problem. And oh, guess what? I have a solution for this too. Cool. I'm really glad I can help here. That's a really good feeling to be able to do that and to do it like on a call with them too and be like, oh, I got this. Like I can actually help you get to where you want to go. Because now I have all the data and I can make sense of this for you. But it's understandable why just having this data, not really knowing how to put it together and make sense of it, it's understandable why you would think that what you're after is unrealistic. It's not unrealistic. We just need to take a different approach. And that approach might simply be being a little more stringent with the accountability up front. So being a little more stringent with tracking in the app, being a little less flexible with these meals out, being a little more concrete with what constraints we're going to have with these meals, being a little more methodical with the kind of cardio that we're doing and the kind of modalities, not this like fluid, like non-binary aspect of, well, I just need you to train really hard and put forth like a good amount of effort. It's like, yeah, but this person's not seeing results. I think it's one thing if you're seeing results and you're getting away with some flexibility and being a little looser. It's another thing entirely if this person is failing to see results despite what feels like a great degree of effort. And that's where I think literally going through, open your app, put it in your app, figure out, okay, what am I eating? What is not getting reported? Because that's another thing too. Even if you log everything in your FitnessPal, your chronometer, what isn't making it into the diary? What little things here and there? And maybe you have this like slush fund of like, oh, well, hey, I know I tend to eat graze the exact same amount every day and I'm not going to log it because it's so negligible. Okay, cool. As long as it's not impeding progress. I think so many people will move away from approaching this in a practical sense and they will begin to escalate this into now an emotional problem, which then can be compounding because really when you consider, okay, I can't lose weight. Yes, that's the symptom. That's the thing that is in your face. But the problem itself is there's not a skill or an understanding of what is preventing you from losing weight. It could be as simple as mathematics, like, hey, the equation's off and like you're not in a big enough deficit to continue to see the fat loss that you'd like to see. Maybe you never were. Maybe initially there was some skewing and what you did see was an initial change in potentially even fluid, GI weight, stress. And now why you're not seeing that same drop is because you were never in a big enough deficit to begin with. Going back to approaching this in a practical sense, going back to, okay, I have everything logged. I've crossed all my T's, I've dotted my I's. I can see here is how I'm creating this deficit. Here is what I think I'm creating every single day. Because remember, it is just a guess. Like, I mean, you're just hoping that you're in that. I mean, you can use then the outcome to confirm whether or not that's the kind of deficit that you were actually in. But ultimately, there are transient losses and gains that you're, I guess, inputs and outputs that you're not going to be able to account for. So it's like, in order to do your best here, we need to control the variables that are easily controlled, which is going to be food. Food is much easier to control versus setting this impossible target on the output standpoint that ultimately it's going to be really difficult to quantify whether there are changes just based on your adaptations that occur from doing cardio, doing that kind of cardio for so long. Like what you need to do is get out of your head. You need to focus on your behaviors. What are the actions that are occurring on a regular basis that are either A, taking you from doing the thing that you need to do that's going to get you where you want to go, or B, what is the obstacle? What is preventing you from moving forward? Either scenario, if you have control over it, well, then that's something to address. That's something to take a closer look at. If you don't have control over it, if it is a time constraint that truly like there is no wiggle room, okay, well, that doesn't mean that we can't make an adjustment. that might actually mean, hey, we're not going to have you continue to escalate cardio up in a way that ultimately makes it more difficult and harder for you to adhere to and leads to you not being able to adhere on a consistent basis. Instead, let's lower intake, put you in a position where, hey, doing less cardio, you might actually be less hungry throughout the day just on account of your output is now lower. There are ways that we can play with this equation. There's ways that we can accommodate based on your needs. But without being honest, without really getting specific with what those disruptors are, what are the things that are making it harder for you to be in the deficit that you need to be in order to lose the weight that you're trying to lose, we want to demonstrate this integrity across a multitude of circumstances. We want to see that your ability to adhere is not limited by being in this bubble of an environment that, unless everything is absolutely perfect, adherence is not on the table. If that's the case, well, for the short term, it's going to work. Okay. But what happens inevitably when you're not in that environment? What happens when you are traveling? What happens when you do miss ordering an Instacart, or you don't make it to the store, or your spouse doesn't do the chicken like they said they were going to do? And now you're just like, okay, well, I didn't have a plan B. I didn't have a best case scenario in this circumstance. We need to set you up for success no matter the resources, no matter the time constraints, no matter the level of stress. And I think that's where, like before, what I was talking about with the ease at which you can adhere to the diet, that matters so much. I mean, like, yes, you can start to get fancy with it. You can start to add in different types of meals, and you can try different types of recipes, and, maybe move your nutrient timing around because you want to save up calories for X, Y, and Z. You can go out to eat, and you can, practice the skill of making these estimations with food reporting. But until you have a system in place that allows for consistent and repeatable results, I wouldn't try to get cute with it. I wouldn't try to do too much. Ultimately, I think this is a form of self-sabotage. I think this is how a lot of people end up digging themselves into a hole where they're like, well, this diet didn't work for me. No, dude, you were trying to be way too perfect. Like, you were committed only to doing it one type of way. And that way was very unrealistic given where you are in your own skill, in your own developmental process relative to dieting. I think across the board, whenever we're talking about getting back on track, you need to be able to establish continuity. And that might come from initially starting very simple, having very simple decisions to make, not getting bogged down and like everything has to be optimized, everything has to be perfect. Well, okay, let's say adherence was like close to perfect, it wasn't 100%. Does that now affect your ability to go to bed on time? Does that affect your ability in the gym to get your water intake in? Like, these things shouldn't really bleed over into other variables, yet they do. Yet we see they do all the time. So really taking a closer look at, okay, like, what aspect of this program, what is the biggest constraint, or I guess the most impactful constraint? What area am I my weakest in? What area am I strongest in? Which one am I able to do consistently no matter the circumstance, whether I'm stressed, whether I haven't got a lot of sleep, whether I have to reorganize my entire schedule. So then in order to get to the gym, now I'm going at a much later time. Maybe I'm not having pre-workout, so my lift isn't going to be as good, but I'm still going to get it done. Like, really understanding, okay, here's the framework in which you operate and you succeed in. I think it really comes down to figuring out, okay, what is the weakest link and what can we do to improve whatever our effort is being put in and what kind of outcome that reflects. It doesn't have to be perfect out the gate. This can take some troubleshooting. It can take trying different methods. Listen, I'm telling you, I've tracked macros like 15 years now. This is something, it does take time. It does take the development and the reflection and figuring out, okay, this worked well for me in this setting. Now it no longer does. Okay, what other alternatives are there? I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you are interested in signing up for one-on-one services, I do offer coaching, consultations. I got the free webinar coming out 16th, 18th. If you're not able to make any of those times or dates, don't worry. I'm going to send out the recording. Just go ahead and sign up anyways. If you would, like, comment, subscribe on YouTube, leave me a review on Spotify. Thank you guys for watching. And as always, I will see you in the next one.